Good morning, Year 10. This is the last recording in the series, you'll be happy to know, before summer starts. So again, we're continuing with Paper 1, Question 5, Descriptive and Narrative Writing, and today's lesson is all about endings. So first task, do now task. Do stories always have to have a resolution or a happy ending? I'll come to a conclusion. Should they have a happy ending, and what makes a good ending? So the first thing I want you to do is jot down any ideas and answers that you have in response to each one of those questions. You can either do it in a mind map or a list or a bullet point list, it's up to you. But remember to submit these with your work. So just pause it while you have a go at that. Okay, so here is our link task. Many authors and writers decide to plant the seeds for their ending very early on in the novel. And we've looked at that before when we're studying text before. We often look at foreshadowing, where writers leave little hints as to what's going to happen or what's going to happen at the end. And so what I want you to consider is this a good technique? Should we be using foreshadowing? Should we be hinting at what our ending is almost quite early on? So as you can see on the screen, if you've got someone you might discuss your ideas with, you can do that. If not, if you're on your own, just write down your ideas and send those in. Okay, so we're going to have a look at what creates an effective ending. And the first thing I want you to think about is when you're going on a journey, it really wouldn't be a good idea to set off on that journey unless you actually knew where you were going. So you got, like from the picture, you would have a map and you'd plan out where you were going. Otherwise, your journey would take you on lots of unexpected twists and turns. You might get lost, and that's exactly the same as when we're writing a story. If you don't plan where that story is going to end and where it's going to end up, you'll get lost. So it's really important when you're writing a piece of fiction to plan that, and it can really make or break your story. And if you've been in school this week, I'm sure you've been looking at what happens when an ending is really, really rubbish. So you don't want to spoil all that really hard work when you're in the exam, that you've been crafting your vocabulary, you've described your characters, and you're setting all that work we've been doing over the last few weeks. You don't want to ruin that by then just plonking on a rubbish ending at the end. So, for example, my favourite author, I think this is not a surprise that I'm making reference to J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, but she planned the ending of the whole Harry Potter series before the first book was published. So when she was writing Harry Potter, she knew exactly what was going to happen at the end of the 7th book. So that way she could make sure in every single book and every single event, it all built up to that spectacular ending and that finale. So you need to almost do the same. Obviously, we're not writing a feature-length novel or film. You're obviously only going to be writing quite a short story in the exam, but you still need to have a direction. You still need to make sure that everything matches, that everything builds up, and that's what we're going to make sure we work on today. So let's think about what makes a really rubbish ending. And I want you to make a mind map, or you could do it in a list, it's up to you. But I want you to include at least 5 things you should avoid when writing an ending. Okay, so what would make a rubbish ending? And jot down at least 5 things. Go. Okay, so make sure you send yours in, but here's what I got and what I suggest to you that you should avoid like the plague. So the first one is, I woke up and it was all a dream. Yeah, I think you can probably work that out for yourself why that's a really rubbish ending. It's quite simplistic. It's a bit of a cop out, really, and examiners absolutely hate it. I think you would really be annoyed if you went to cinema and you watched a film and then it was really exciting all the way through and then it just cut to a scene where the character woke up and it was all a dream, you just feel like you've been cheated out of, a real ending, so to speak. So make sure that things that frustrate you in stories or films, that then you don't rectify and put that in your own work, because it's not gonna make you work very good. Number two, and that was the end of a really bad day. Again, very, very simplistic. It's something we'd expect almost, primary level, isn't it? Look at the vocabulary that's used there as well. It's another cop out, really. So yeah, let's not include something like that. They all went home and went to bed. That cuts too short. Again, we don't have any sort of excitement there. Very simplistic. I've seen this before, believe it or not. Their parents told them off and they never did it again. Believe it or not, one of the GCSE questions was to write a story about a difficult decision. And there were two characters who had to make a difficult decision about whether they were to disobey their parents and go and do something wrong. And by the end of it, they got caught and the parents told them off and they never did it again. And again, I felt really cheated out of that ending. And it was quite a nice storyline, but the ending was just rubbish. So let's avoid that. And please, where possible, let's avoid death. So let's avoid anything like then he died or then she died, or even worse, then I died. Any form of death at the end, again, it feels a bit of a cop out. If you really want to include something sinister like death, personally, I'd like to avoid that. But if you do want to include something, quite sinister like that, it needs to be constructed a bit more effectively than just abruptly say, oh, and then he died. And it needs to be maybe something more metaphorical about, being greeted by darkness, or talk about it in a more metaphorical way. You can craft it a bit more effectively then. So now we've looked at what makes a rubbish ending, let's have a look at what makes a good ending. So, firstly, it has to have some sort of resolution and explain some unanswered questions. And what I mean by that is not that necessarily everything has to come to a conclusion and everything has to be solved, but at least something has to be solved. You can't leave your readers with too many unanswered questions, because then you just get really frustrated that it's not a real ending. Secondly, characters are rewarded or punished for their behaviour in the story. So, for example, if you're writing like a thrilling quest and you've got a prince or some sort of character going on a quest to retrieve some treasure, you might not have them retrieve the treasure. That might be a twist at the end, but they're at least rewarded in a different way. Or similarly, if you're writing a story about a villain and they've conducted lots of evil deeds throughout the story, that then some sort of punishment is given at the end. What appears to be dangerous or menacing turns out to be harmless. So you could have almost like a bit of a twist. So something that's been described as quite sinister all the way through might actually not be as bad as it sounded, and it can be quite unexpected. So that's sometimes quite a nice idea. Most story endings conform to their genre, so abide by the rules of their genre. So, for example, if you're writing a fairy tale in that sort of style, in that genre, it tends to be the heroine marries the handsome prince at the end, and the cruel, wicked characters are punished. It's good to follow those rules. You might want to mix it up slightly, but be careful not to deviate too much. So if you're writing a fairy tale and the heroine might choose not to marry the handsome prince, but don't then have some sort of alien come out of nowhere and then whisk her away to an alien planet, it doesn't match. So just be careful if you're going to, play around with generic conventions, that you don't go off too much on a tangent or in a different direction that your reader's not going to follow. Characters discover solutions to problems. So it might not necessarily be the solution they were after, but they might get something else. They might learn something else. Calm or some sort of order is restored. at the end. So if it's been very chaotic in your story, it might be nice to end with some sort of calm. Characters learn a lesson. So we talked about, being rewarded or punished. So, again, that sort of fits in with that idea that it comes to some sort of resolution. Please make sure your ending is believable and not too far-fetched. I mentioned that just a moment ago. Twists are brilliant, and they work really, really well, unless they're completely unrealistic and they do not fit with what you've already written. So please be careful if you're going to include a twist. And then finally, I quite like this one, is a temporary state of calm. That means if you've had quite a chaotic or mysterious story, it might be that when you get to the end, it seems like everything's restored, but actually it's not. There's a little hint at the end that things might kick off again, or it might spiral out of control, or the calm is very fragile. So a story that springs to mind that you should have been revising fairly recently is Macbeth, for example. At the end of Macbeth, Macbeth is killed for being a traitor, and Malcolm, the king's son, is crowned the rightful king of Scotland. And this era of calm is created there. Everything's back to normal. Malcolm's on the throne, and he should have been on the throne because he was the rightful heir. But we get that calm is only ever temporary, because we know from the witch's prophecy, about Banquo and his sons, that Fleance and Fleance's descendants will become kings. So there's that hint there. Will Malcolm also be betrayed in the same way Duncan will? Will it be Fleance that eventually takes the throne? And lots of people miss that, and it's just a little hint at the end for those people spotting it. That not everything is as it seems. It might seem that it's a good ending, but it's fragile. And that's always quite a nice one to end with. So now we've had a little bit of a discussion about, how we might end different stories. I want you to take a look at different endings yourself. So just like when composers are writing a piece of music, they like their songs to build up and into a huge crescendo and it gets really loud, or they might ask their musicians to fade out their instruments. They might just cut it really short. They might almost replay the opening, so it almost goes round in a circle. So just like songs, stories have to do things like that as well. You might build it up to a climax, you might fade it out to calm, you might want to, have a really abrupt ending. It's up to you. But we're going to look at what endings are the best to use and maybe easiest to use without losing some marks. So take a look at the next slide in a minute. And what I want you to do, if you can with a partner, it might be good to discuss your ideas. If not, have a go on your own. Have a look at these different types of story endings. And I want you to think about which one you think is the most effective and make sure you give us reasons why. And your challenge is, can you think of any stories or films that have used these ending styles already? So just to make it dead clear, if you've got a piece of paper, you might want to write these down. If you can print this slide out, then great. If not, you might just want to type directly into your computer. But you've got 6 different types of story ending here. You've got closing the circle, the tie back, the time frame, the place, look to the future, and the payoff. Now, underneath each one, you'll see that it gives you a little bit of an explanation about what each ending is, what it does. So closing the circle, for example, brings the story around in a circle. It echoes the beginning. So it might reintroduce us to the character we started off with, or go back to a place or a moment at which it started. Preferably not a dream, though. We have just sort of talked about that. So look at the definitions of each ending. Write down why you think it might be a good ending. So I want an answer for each one and make sure you submit those. And then finally, consider which one do you think is the best. Okay, off you go. Okay, so now you've had a little bit of a think about which ending you thought was best out of those 6. We're going to then look at what technique is used here. So if this clip doesn't work, you might want to follow that YouTube link there if you can see it. The clip is called Stay in My Memory by Bim. So even if you just type that into YouTube, you should be able to come up. So when we watch this, I want you to consider which ending is used in this clip. And do you think it's an effective ending? What's your point of view? And write down your ideas. I actually want you to send those ideas into your teacher. So if this clip doesn't work, you might have to search it for yourself. Apologies if it doesn't work. Bear with me for a minute. Right, it looks like it's just going to be buffering forever, so we will skip that. So if you were watching that clip, hopefully you have, and you've not just skipped it, but the ending that was used was closing the circle. So they started off as a couple together, and then the female character lost her a male partner or a male friend, and she went on a quest to sort of almost find him and find herself, and she kept almost seeing glimpses of him, and then at the end they were reunited. So this is one of the most popular endings. And for many writers, they like to return to a place or an event that reminds us of the beginning. It might not be exactly like the beginning, but it reminds us of the beginning. And again, we'll go back to Macbeth. We see that when the events of the play come full circle. So right at the very beginning of the play, the Thane of Cawdor is executed for being a traitor and going against the king. And then Macbeth gets Thane of Cawdor, and he, at the end, is executed as a traitor. So it reminds us about what happened at the beginning and that these events were always going to happen. It was almost like fate. And this is a really effective device to use in your exam, because if you craft it that way, it shows your examiner you have got what it says on the exam's mark scheme as whole text crafting. Okay, and this is quite a complex technique to use, but it's quite easy once you get used to using it. So your narrative doesn't need to be really, really long. It doesn't need to be a full-length novel, but it can include the same spot that it started off with. So why not finish with the same paragraph you used for your opening? How, that would be really, if as long as you crafted that opening paragraph, you might change one or two words at the end, but it's a really good technique to consider. So that'd be a bit of advice from me, really. So here's your resilience task. I want you to have a go at using closing the circle technique. So can you create an opening paragraph that you could use for an ending? Okay, so think about where your story is going to start, what's going to happen in the middle, but that ending has got to be something that returns to that start. So almost like you can reuse that paragraph again. So plan what your narrative's going to be first. Plan what's going to happen in your story. So think about all that work we've been doing over the last few weeks. Plan it, setting, mood, characters. Try to produce your opening paragraph. Write down what your plan would be, and then your teacher can see where that opening paragraph would double up as your opening and your ending. Now, if this is confusing, please contact your class teacher and they'll be able to explain it in a little bit more detail. There's two pictures on the screen, so you might want to use either of those as inspiration. It's completely up to you, or you might want to do your own. You might even want to take a story that you've already written for some of the previous lessons and have a go at tweaking that a little bit to make that fit. But make sure you send us what you do. Okay, so here's lesson 2. Lesson 1 was an introduction as to what makes a good ending, and obviously we looked at some tips and closing the circle. This lesson, we're going to encourage you to develop these ideas a little bit more and consider how we can utilise the opening and your ending to create a really effective story. So here's your do now for lesson 2. And I want you to provide feedback. I want you to give us your opinion on each of the story openings in that table below. And then I want you to make a prediction as to how you think each story will end. So let's start with the first column. Okay, this type of story opens with a character. Okay, so once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. In that table, so you can either draw it out on a piece of paper or you might type directly into the slide or in a Word document. What's your feedback of ending? Do you think opening with characters is good? Do you think it's rubbish? Brutally honest, how do you feel about stories that open straight away with their characters? I want a prediction. What do you think is going to happen at the end of this story? Because it's how do you think it's going to end? Every single one. So I want you to have a look at a setting, so a place, and then I want you to look at how a story opens. So speech, is that a good way to open a story? What might happen? What might happen at the end if it begins with speech? Have a statement, one that opens with action, and then finally the one with question. So just pause the recording whilst you go through. Okay, so let's take this table and we're going to, if you have each one of those openings was from a famous story. So this one was The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. You might have recognised that from the names of the characters in the film. My favourite, Harry Potter, in there. We've got George's Marvellous Medicine, we've got Matilda, and The Toilet of Doom. So each one of those is a fairly recent story. Your first bronze task is give me your opinion, and hopefully you've given me that. This time, might each one be good? So even if you've, for example, said starting with characters is a rubbish idea, and now I want you to think, why might character be a good idea? And jot down a bit of positive one. Then you need to challenge yourself to the silver task. I want you to write down how ending with the same technique could improve. You start with a character and then end with a character. Why might that be a really good technique to use? Okay, so we're almost looking at closing the circle different ways. So how might we use closing the circle with starting and ending on action? You know, could we actually create would it be a good ending to end with some action? So give me and pause the tape while you jot them down and make sure you send them in as part of this week's work. Okay, so it's not just endings that are important, just as crucial. They need to hook the reader in. But endings in your story, if you don't get them right, you need to sustain that interest. You need to hook the reader in and you need to keep them engaged in the middle. So they're still as enticed right at the end. That is how high marks on this element of the exam, because it's all about consistency, okay, and making sure that crafting is all the way. Don't ruin your hard work at the beginning by getting lazy. When you've been writing for a long time in the exam and the clock's ticking away, yourself to keep that momentum and don't ruin all that hard work by the ending. So openings and endings are very closely linked. Therefore, be given equal care and attention when you're writing. You should be planning your ending just as carefully as you're planning that opening. We look briefly at closing the circle, and that's where the end brings us to the beginning, or it reminds us of the beginning. You're asked to consider why starting and ending with the same technique. And I'm hoping it led you to think about closing the circle. So look at how to decide which ending is the right fit. So let's take each one of these endings. For each of the famous openings, you're going to consider what if we use different techniques. So let's have a look. Let's opening with a character. So once there were 4 children whose Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. You've already given me your feedback. That's a good technique. So let's see how if we've never read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and we would give that opening line, what do we think the ending would be if we use Look to the Future? What do we think the ending would be like in the circle? And what do we think the ending would be like to this story? Okay, so if we use the future, okay, so that's where, you know, we're looking for, okay, a possible ending could be that the story could end with a glimpse of what holds for each of the characters. So what does the future hold for Peter, Edmund, and Lucy after, you know, the quest in the story? Maybe closing the circle, the story could end back with the 4 characters together. The relationship has changed in some way. Maybe at the beginning of the story, they were very friendly, it was quite fractious. Or at the end, after going and all the, you know, marvellous things they've done through Narnia, maybe they're a family knit group. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they were really close at the beginning. The ending is quite fractious. And then finally, the story would be like if we use the payoff. Maybe this ending, characters succeeded in their quest and they've got, you know, they've their character and strengthened their bond. So it's maybe a little bit like closing the circle. More of a resolution. We have a payoff. We have a feeling of at the end. There's some sort of reward. Maybe not necessarily financial, but there are characters at the end. Now in the little blue bubble, just know
read those red possible endings again, notice how each ending. Okay, so I'm taking you back several weeks here. Planning your story is essential because you need to think about your character to how you want your reader to feel at the end of the story. So if you're starting with a character, you need to end that story to achieve that impact. Okay, achieve that sense of fulfillment or sense of nostalgia. Closing the circle or using the payoff. Each ending can really impact on how your reader is feeling. You to think about. So here's your bronze task. Okay, have a look at opening with a question. Have a go on your own now. What do you think the ending would be like if these 3 techniques were used? I want you to write down like I did on the previous slide. So, ever been flushed down the toilet? What would this story be like if you used the future? What would it be like at the end if we use the tie back? The ending be if we use the payoff? Jot down. Okay, make sure you send those in. Now I'm hoping the bronze task, I want you to challenge yourself with this example. A little bit of a harder one. So opening with speech. In the village, George's mother said, I think I was supposed to say instead of said, guys, George's mother said to George on Saturday morning, so be get up to mischief. So what would this story end in the time frame? What would it be like if you use the tie back? And what would it be like if you use the place? Again, same sort of idea, but you've got a couple of ones there, particularly maybe the time frame. So challenge yourself with the if that was the opening. Gold task. So here you've got 4. So now you've done both the bronze and the task. I want you to challenge yourself with this gold example. So this is probably the most. So imagine we've got a story that starts with action. So Peter stirring the embers so that the sparks swarmed up like imps of hell. What would the ending be if you used time? What would it be to look to the future? What would it be if we used payoff? What would it be if we used the place? I'd say if you're finding this the place, that might be the easiest one because you have a little bit of a be, and then work your way through the others. Again, right, you might do it in the mind map like I've done on the screen or in the list. And here's a final thought for you to ponder and think about. Can you think of an opening and an ending that would fit any or topic of a story? So can you think of a way story or end it that would fit no matter whether you were writing a film or a gothic horror or an adventure, a sci-fi? Is there ever an ending that you craft that would fit any type of story? And if you can think of a way to start that and end that, would you be interested in that to use in the exam? Do you think that would be something good to do? I'd be really interested to know your thoughts on that. Please send them in. I also just wanted to say well done. Okay, now this is our last session. From all of us at the English department, we miss you so much. I hope you really well. I hope you have a lovely summer, but please don't forget September. If you are feeling a little bit left it's okay. Just do what you can to catch up. We will things over summer. Hopefully you've signed up to Seneca already. If you've not, no. But please rest. Get ready for we can't wait to see you. Take care. Have a wonderful